Hi, welcome back. My name is Carrie Watts. I'm so glad you're here today, and I'm going to share with you some watercolor techniques that I use when working with fall leaves. Fall is my favorite time of year, and I just went outside and picked a few leaves off the ground and going to show you how I paint them. I can't tell you how many leaves I've painted in the past. This one I've found on a hike in North Georgia, and this was a very similar leaf, slightly different, and just had so much fun painting with them. The way I set up a painting of a leaf is I find a leaf outside and I get some sort of light. I have a lamp here that I can tilt and shift, and you can see the cast shadow. And preferably, if you've never done this before, I would get one of these smaller leaves, not the gigantic ones unless you want to paint large or draw freehand. This is a way that I can create a painting and just have a lot of fun with it and not a lot of stress. So the first thing you do is you bring in a leaf that you like. You find a piece of paper that's big enough to hold the leaf and its cast shadow, and get a pencil. If you have a small bit of tape, it's helpful. I'm going to get just a tiny bit of masking tape so that my leaf stays still, and you tape it down to your paper, your surface, very lightly. You know, again, I'm deciding which way I like the shadow, and I can just shift my paper around, but I think I'm just going to leave it, well, I don't know, I might want it more sideways, more dynamic. There we go. I like having the opening of light up under here. I think that's interesting, and it has a very small shadow here. So I'm going to get a mechanical pencil, and it might not look exactly like I'm tracing the lines from your point of view, but I'm at a different angle than the camera. So I'm just looking at the edge. I close one eye and I'm following the edge of the leaf. I'm not doing anything with the shadow right now. I'm just following the edge of the leaf from my vantage point, which again will be different from what the camera shows. And if this is hard for you, then just lay the leaf flat and trace the thing. Now I'm coming back very lightly and I'm drawing the edges of the shadows. Often you'll have more than one shadow because of more than one light source, so just pick the strongest one and ignore the others. And there's more than one way to paint a shadow. You'll get the idea. I do want you to look, I think right now, well, that's because of the added light. There's another light in here, so there's light here. But sometimes, instead of the darkest dark being close, can you see? I don't know if you can see that. But sometimes the light coming through the leaf will cast a colored shadow to where this would have some warmth to it because this is kind of the reddish orange, and you can see some of that color in your shadows. So just look for things like that to make it more interesting. Okay, again, we barely touched the paper with that tape, and we don't want to damage that. So you can go now and decide, okay, do I want to draw any of the veins? There's one that's down the center. Note if the veins join at the same place or if they alternate. It's important, I think, to pay attention to little things in nature because it makes it seem more lifelike. And that's not exactly straight because the leaf is bending. So I'm going to put that bend in rather than making it exactly straight. Pay attention to things like that too. That's slightly bent. This one alternates down here. So I thought that's interesting. This one's pretty close to right together. This one's right together. And then they alternate up here. So you can put out however many you want in there. I just try to indicate just a little bit. And then I look to see, okay, what's the lightest part of my leaf? What's the lightest color? Well, the lightest color is one of the pale yellow greens. So because the pale yellow green is almost over the entire leaf, that's what I'm going to start the entire leaf with. I didn't realize I'd drawn as dark as I had. Maybe, hopefully you can still see it. But I'm lightening up my drawing just a tad before I start painting. The watercolors I'll be using today are from Jack Richeson and Company. It's the Yarka St. Petersburg-Ultimate Watercolors 36 Professional. And this is the key that I made to go with the set. And these are the colors. I've really enjoyed working with this, especially on the go, because it's quite extensive as far as your choices, but it doesn't take up an excessive amount of room. It gives me a lot of places to mix colors, and then I can mix other larger sections of color over here if I want to. I always recommend making a key with any watercolors that you use. This particular one, if you get it, I would also recommend that you take out these little pans, write the name. You can, you can see that they are full pans, but if by chance they fall out, if you have it written on here, raw sienna, and you also have the place for it here written, then you'll know where it goes. It's very helpful, especially when you get to these dark tones and you can't tell what they are. It comes with its own chart, but the chart's on the back, and I can't see it when it's on the back. So I wanted it to where I had it accessible and I could easily see what color it was. Occasionally when you close this up, these are semi-moist, so they stick to the mixing tray and fall out that way on occasion. What I also like about this set, it also told me what was opaque and transparent, so I transferred that information. If it's transparent, I have the open square, semi-transparent, half-colored, more opaque color, more solid. So that's the traditional signage for that particular characteristic. So I'm going to have this off camera, but I'm going to try to explain to you what colors that I am using. In dealing with watercolor, you normally work from light to dark. So I'm looking at this leaf, and oops, would help to have it the right side up for you. And the lighter parts not only are the veins, but some of the variety of colors out here. So you can have a choice depending on how comfortable you are with your watercolors to work the whole leaf at the same time. But I often find it very helpful to just work one half of the leaf at a time, and luckily we have this lovely divider line. So that's kind of what I'm going to do, so I can flip back and forth between the sides. As one side dries, I can work on the other, and so on and so forth, and we'll see how that goes. So that's my plan. I want to start with the lighter color that I see. So I see a pretty rich yellow that I'll also be adding drops of green in and brown. So I'm coming over to my paints and I'm picking what I would consider a cad yellow. I want this to be pretty intense because I do like the fall color richness of the leaves. And I'm going to be working wet on wet eventually. So I want to mix up some green that is very similar to this. I'm picking up what's called olive green on my palette, and I'm adding some emerald green to it. that's a little too, to me, Kelly green. So in order to tone down a green, you pick something that's similar to opposite. So I'm just picking up a little bit of what I would consider kind of a magenta color. Might have added a little too much of that, but that's okay. All right, so I have a little puddle. Sorry, you can't see that. A little puddle of yellow and green. So I'm going to start I'm just going to load my brush. I just roll it in the paint and I point to the outside. I'm going to go all the way down to the tip. I barely touch the brush to the paper and I can get a nice thin line. If I was working at a tilt, which I often do when I'm working in the studio, my paint would be wet enough that it would create sort of a puddle. You see a little bit of puddling here, which is fine, and so I'm going all the way up to the tip. Reload my brush just a little bit. It's getting a little dry hitting through here. Okay, so it's still wet and moist. If it's not, then I'm adding a little bit more paint to it. While that's wet and without rinsing out my brush, I'm coming in here and laying in some of the green. I'm just going to let it do its thing. If I want a little more intense, see how bright that is? That's a little too intense for my taste, but maybe it'll tone itself down as it dries. I'm not too concerned about where the other veins are. I want to add a variety of this green in, and I can always lift off a little bit of the vein part if I need to. Now I'm going to go in Madder Lake is what the color I just went in, and I'm going to drop in some of this reddish color right into the green because red and green are opposites on the color wheel. So when you put red into the green, they often neutralize each other. Right now that looks pretty red, and I'm hoping that as this dries, that it will kind of soften. We will find out. And that was all with one load of a brush. I'm now picking up what's called English red. It's kind of a terracotta red. And I'm going to come in with that. Ooh, it's really wet. Let me take some of the moisture out of my brush. I just dab it on a paper towel. Now, while that is pretty moist, pretty damp, I'm going to drag my brush where the veins are and lift off some of the paint. Just gives another subtle, very subtle line. As long as your brush is drier than the paper, it will act like a sponge. There's some light reflecting down here, so I might lay this down and lift up a little bit more. There's a little light right off this part. You see how dry that is? You might not can see it. There's light here, here, and here. Okay, I'm going to start with the other side and do a similar wash. I just realized I didn't quite follow my pattern. All right, I'll alternate. Well, hello. Load your brush, Carrie. Would help. I'm going to load my brush with the yellow. It's going to be a little watery because I started it that way. If some of the other side bleeds over, that's okay. Not really worried. And that, I got a little far out, I wasn't paying attention. And that's okay too. This is just a practice. I was getting confused with where the vein was and where the edge of the leaf was. Alright, that's all very wet. While it's wet, I'm going to do what I did on the other one, and I'm going to add the greens. Bouncing around a little bit. You don't want it all solid, one color. It's a little darker in this area. I'm going to pick up another bit of green that's a little darker than that. While that's still wet, I'm going to go get that red that I used on the other side. I'm liking how that bit dried. I put the colors in similar to what I see where they are. I'm not trying to be too picky as to where they go, but I do want it to mimic the leaf I'm looking at. I'm going to rinse out my brush, and I'm going to go in with more of the English red. A little bit more of that terracotta red that I had. I think I'm going to add a little more darker green on this side. So I have the emerald green that I'm going to mix with a little bit of a red. That'll tone it down, make it a little darker. Yeah, I like that better. While I'm putting some of that over there, I'm going to put some of that on this side. Sometimes I just get carried away and have to spread one color on the other side. Okay, if you get too hard of an edge, you can wipe your brush off, dampen it, and soften the edge. But you really shouldn't layer until the other side is dry. As I'm painting a little bit around this vein, I want to make sure that I stay on the outside of the vein. We'll see. My paper's still fairly wet, so this is wet on wet. If it gets too wet again, I can just dab my brush and absorb some of that. I don't want to make cauliflower blooms, but I'm liking the variation of adding that darker tone of green. It's a little safer to do that where it's dry. I really am enjoying these brushes in the fact that I can load it up, and when I rotate and kind of spin it, roll it in the paint, it holds quite a bit of paint, and it allows me to kind of bounce around and add color in a variety of places. The advantage of this type of brush over the brushes I usually use is it's only adding the water that's already mixed in the paint, so it's not continually diluting your color. In the other paints that I use, the other brushes that I use, there's a continual flow of water. And when you have a continual flow of water, you have less control. But that's why I also normally don't start those paintings off with flooded paper. So this side's fairly dry. I'm coming back with a little more dynamic brown, reddish brown. And you could be as detailed with this as you want. I'm just having a lot of fun. I hope you're getting something out of this as well. I can't tell you how many leaves I paint every year. I started this a few years ago. Actually, I haven't been painting watercolors, but a few years. I started painting watercolor in 2016. And watercolors will dry lighter than what you see. And I'm not trying to make it as dark as the leaf that in real life. I'm just trying to capture the essence of it. And I'm going to go back around some of these areas, add just a little more highlight of yellow. Just seems to be, and I could have used more of a yellow ochre, but I like the light color and the brightness of it. I'll add a little bit of the yellow ochre. Now you can use whatever colors you want. It's your leaf. Okay. And I let that be more yellow. Some of it was still white. Coming back with some darker brown would help to load my brush better. I don't want it drippy wet, so it's just a damp brush rolling in the paint that's directly in the palette. So now I'm going to come back, add some of those tiny little darker drops of paint to get some of the darkness in the leaf that I see. It's really fun to add the tiny details, and you can kind of get carried away with it. But that's one reason why when I pick out the leaves that I'm painting, I look for something that has a discoloration, a variety of tones. It just makes for a fun. Oops, I wiped too much off my brush. There. All right, I think I'm going to let that dry, and then we'll come back with the shadows. I noticed when I stepped away that I had not made a line over here for the vein. So this is just water on my brush. I'm going to see if I can lift off a little bit of this. I don't want to lift too much, but I just want to indicate that there is a hint of a line. All I'm looking is that most of the edge is dry, which it is. And I've done a little swatch here of some shadow colors that I mixed. I usually take a violet, a dark blue, and a brown. Wet them together. Then I test it on a index card. If I want it less blue, I'll add more brown. So I've got my brush loaded. I'm now coming up. I'm going to look again at shadow. I moved my lamp so it's not exactly where it was before. So, alright, that is fairly dark, and I loaded my brush too much, so I'm going to dab it on the paper towel, come back, touch it, and see how it lifts it right up. If you don't want a hard edge on the outside of your shadow, then come back with a wet brush and soften that edge. Okay, so I'm going to do the next one. Load this. It's wet enough to move, but it's not making too much of a puddle. I want to come right up to the leaf. Probably could have loaded the brush a little bit more. You don't want so little wet that you leave streaks in your shadows. Okay, I'm going to wet my brush again, and I'm going to drag along the edge. Sometimes in shadows, the closest to the part of the shadow closest to the object is darker. Sometimes it's lighter because the light's shining through. So I just went back and added a little bit more before it dried too much, and we'll see how that does. Best that you not overwork it. I should have left it alone probably and make this a little smoother line. Okay. Again, load my brush. This is a bigger shadow. It's all connected, so I want to be careful this time. And I'm going to work from left to right because I'm right-handed. I did load the brush with a lot more color and moisture because I want it to last all the way to the edge of this section. Get skinny in through here. You can also tilt your paper toward your leaf if you want the darkness to hang near the leaf. Whoops. There it went. Okay, the only problem I have here is I got out of the line there and there is no shadow there. I'll make that a little wider, maybe hide that. Okay, I'm going to just change the shape of the shadow. Oh my, artist prerogative. Try to incorporate that into it. It might make sense. Whoop, I don't know about pulling this up a little bit. That'll probably, I don't know. Yeah, that might mess up that shadow. Okay, I'm going to rinse out my brush, and I'm going to again go along the outside edge to soften this as though it's getting farther away from the source of light and diffusing. So as long as you do that while it's wet and don't let it dry too much, then that works. I'm back. This is dried, and I want to show you how, if I want a water droplet on a dried painting, how I create it. This is one that I did earlier this week, well, last week, not that it matters. Added that, and I'm going to show you how it's done. I want to pick an area that I can have, if the light's coming from the left like this is, then I want a little bit of light area where I can make it darker. So I'm going to put the water droplet right here. So I'm going to just drop a little bit of water and let it sit for just a second, kind of soak in to the paper, and then start to lift off. It doesn't have to be the white of the paper, but I want it lighter than what's around it. And I'm going to put the darker side closest to the light source. Okay? The reason why I want it closest to the light source is I want the light highlight to show, and then the light diffuses through the water droplet, getting this side lighter and then casting a shadow over here. So I'm going to pick up some of the shadow color that I had with a little more green, and I'm going to just go as wide as that droplet is, and I'm going to let it dry. While the shadow is still a little shiny, I'm going to come back in the inside of this water droplet, and I'm going to make it darker on the far side, trying to leave a highlight area. So I'm going to paint the very outside edge and leave where I feel like the light would be hitting that. And then I want to lightly blur this. Get a tiny bit more water on my brush to soften that edge. And there we go. There's your water droplet. Not much to to affect it, but to me it gives it a great illusion. Remember, the light source comes here. The light is that dot hitting the highlight. You can make it brighter if you want to, but it reads light enough to me. The light diffuses, casting a shadow and adding interest to your painting. Hope you like that.